After the Civil War ended, there came a time of economic upheaval, where rich businessmen took control of entire industries, taking advantage of government's laissez-faire approach to the economy. With new technologies, advancing methods of industrialization, cheap immigrant labor, and a much speedier, streamlined transportation system of both steamships and railroads, the business sector grew rapidly. However, the government couldn't keep up with the changes, and these monopolies took advantage of its flawed domestic policy. This time was called the Gilded Age, originally coined by Mark Twain and represented the few wealthy people that covered up the many dreadfully poor people. First, railroads were monopolized, primarily by Cornelius Vanderbilt. Companies laid down tracks where there was no competition, they set rates as they pleased, and owners became very rich. They refused to pay workers more than the bare minimum, often not enough to live on. Then, seeing this incredible opportunity for power and riches, businessmen came to take advantage of this. Some other primary owners of the monopolies were Andrew Carnegie, the owner of the largest steel company at the time, also J.D. Rockefeller, who took control of 90% of the oil industry, and lastly J.P. Morgan, the owner of the largest banking firm. However, I don't want to focus on the few empowered people. I want to focus on the many powerless people. As the margin between the rich and the poor started becoming increasingly divided, with a smaller middle class, the government tried to fight back, standing as the only voice for the poor. The rich quickly compromised the government through threats and bribes to officials. Owners of these monopolies, or robber barons as they are known, found that they needed the workers to cooperate. They reasoned with the workers about how the monopolies were very beneficial to the people. Robber barons tried to convince the public that their companies brought new jobs to large numbers of people, including immigrants. Owners said that the monopolies brought stabilization to the economy and a backup if there was bankruptcy or other disasters. Also, robber barons claimed that it was their divine right to hold the money for the poor and use the theory of social Darwinism, or the idea that only the strongest and best businessman becomes rich and powerful to support their case. With the government compromised, the people had to back themselves, so unions were formed in order to have enough weight behind their words for the powers to listen. Although there were some victories, many strikes were crushed and unions fell apart. Andrew Carnegie had a theory of a strong man. Quote, "Compromise is usually a sign of weakness, or an admission of defeat. Strong men don't compromise." End quote. This idea was exemplified when he didn't negotiate with his workers when they went on strike for more money. Instead of compromise, Carnegie waited them out or destroyed the strike. He didn't want his workers to get any taste of better living because he knew that if they did, they would want more and he would soon start losing money. Unfortunately, robber barons weren't the only ones hurting unions. Jobless people outside the union also hurt them. Strikebreakers, also known as scabs, were brought in to do work for the companies, replacing union workers when they were on strike. Oil kingpin J.D. Rockefeller and railroad giant Cornelius Vanderbilt hated unions too. They were so big that they could afford to wait out strikes. A lack of negotiation was a problem because it made strikes, such as the Pullman strike, get out of hand, and things started getting destroyed. With this, the monopolies would bring in the government to quell the strike. There were some extreme cases, like the Homestead Steel Strike, where Carnegie hired a private security company to sneak scabs into his factory where a strike was happening just outside. The strikers saw the insurgents and met them with gunfire. The debacle caused 7 workers' lives and created a huge turmoil in the United States. But even with losing lives, the strikers couldn't win. Eventually, they had to resume work in order to put food on the table for their families. After years of being completely helpless against the powerful robber barons, the people finally got an edge up when Franklin Roosevelt became president. He was the first president to refuse to break up a strike with the National Guard and to let the monopoly handle it completely. Soon, bills were passed such as the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. The workers were finally given a say, but the monopolies who would suppress their voice condemned them to such low wages that they couldn't survive, and kept saying that they were doing what was best for the workers and the poor were in trouble. Even until the end, the monopolies stayed at their guns, advocating that they were helpful, that it was their right, and how they didn't see it in the same light as all of the workers. Standard Oil was one of the first to fall, and J.D. Rockefeller never backed down.
Empire unlike any the world has ever seen. But he was also notoriously ruthless, and many believe he went too far. For John D. Rockefeller, Judgment Day is here, in what's become the trial of the century, the people versus Standard Oil.
The picture painted of Standard Oil is a depressing one. No trust in the history of America has been so destructive in its pursuit of profit. Time and time again, we have heard how Standard Oil has used secret kickbacks from the railroads, been routinely engaged in predatory pricing, used intimidation and exclusive sales territories to put refineries out of business. For over 30 years, Standard Oil has been on a mission to crush its competition and establish itself as a monopoly to hoist up the price of kerosene. Mr. Rockefeller, before the court renders its decision, do you have anything you wish to say?
When I came into the oil industry, there was chaos. I brought order. I took a second-rate, inefficient market and built an industry. It was done the way it was because that's the way it had to be done. No one complained when I brought light into every home. No one complained when I provided thousands of jobs or millions of dollars from exports. Oil is what this country runs on. You call it monopoly. I call it enterprise. Now, you tell me, why am I here?
Today, the antitrust laws put in effect to suppress the railroad barons and give workers a chance for a better lifestyle continue to help the U.S. Some examples of its effects is when Microsoft had a monopoly on operating systems and computers until the Department of Justice broke them up in 2001. AT&T is another example. AT&T owned the Bell operating systems, who controlled almost all of the landlines in the United States. Eventually, the United States broke up Bell too. Breaking up the company stopped the phone company from having the full ownership of landlines. This saved the people from having to pay too much for phone and operating systems, as the people of the Gilded Age had to do for oil and railroad tickets.